So I make that 10 a.m. So I'm going to start. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining. Just a quick few housekeeping notes before we start. The session will run for 30 minutes, including 5 minutes at the end or thereabouts for questions. The session is being recorded, so if your camera's on, you may appear in the recording, but please stay on mute during the presentation just to avoid background noise. You're welcome to use the chat to post questions at any time, and I'll aim to address those at the end, or at the end you can unmute yourself and turn the camera on if you like and ask the question directly. Due to time constraints, we won't be taking a practical hands-on approach to reading a specific paper today, so I don't expect you to read the excerpts of the paper that I'm going to show you in the time that we have, but hopefully I can offer you some helpful tips, and the reference to the paper is included in the slides. So a bit about me. I'm a research fellow based at the University of Hertfordshire in the School of Health, Medicine and Life Sciences, as well as a senior advisor working for the Research Support Service in the Centre for Public Health. I'm a mixed methods researcher and I work mainly on projects in kidney disease and the mental health of children and young people relating to mobile phone use. Before starting at the university in 2017, I had a career in public health, so I've been where you are now. Next slide, please. So by the end of the session, I'm hoping that we'll have reached these kind of objectives. So you'll be able to recognise the key sections of a paper, so the abstract, methods, results, etc., and how each part supports different types of reading goals. You should be able to learn how to tailor your reading depending on what you're looking for. So whether it's evidence for a new policy that you're reviewing or translating approach perhaps used in another area to your own local authority patch. And then I'll also show you how you can apply simple questions while reading to help you critically assess the approach and the findings. Next slide, please. So why read research papers? Well, before you start reading a research paper, it's really important to be clear on why you're reading the paper. Ask yourself what you're hoping to learn or achieve. Is it that you just want to understand the current knowledge in a particular area, or are you looking for evidence to help you make a decision, for example, like whether to commission a service or to implement a new programme? You may be curious whether something that's worked in another local area could also work in yours, but whatever the reason, having a clear purpose will really help you to stay focused and get more out of the paper. It also helps us to think about how the paper relates to our own work and area of interest, and what new insights or information you're hoping to take away from it. So it's really important to think about some of these things before you start reading. Okay, so the structure of the paper. So article formats vary by discipline, but most primary research papers will be divided into the following sections. So an abstract, which is sort of a mini version of the paper and gives you a snapshot of what the wider paper tells us. The introduction, which it sort of sets the scene and often tells us about the gap in current research. And then the methods, which will explain the approach that the authors have taken, and the results and conclusion will tell you about what they've found and how they've interpreted that. So beyond these generic elements, section headings can be really useful in helping you to start work through the framework of the paper, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. So some journals have additional files called supplementary online information, and that's not always saved within the paper. It's often extra and you can download that. Often that can be quite complex information, but it will show tables and the data in more detail, which may be useful. It's important to look at the name of the journal. So is it a reputable journal? And those will often be indexed in databases like PubMed and Web of Science, the Directory of Open Access Journals, and other databases like Embase. Also think about when the paper was published, because often you may not be interested in anything that's older than 10 years. It really depends on, again, what the purpose of reading the article is. So there are some key questions that you can ask when reading a paper, and those have come up on the screen already. So what is the paper about? Oh, sorry, Alex, if we could just go back to the last slide. Yeah. So what is the paper about? Why was the study done? And what's the question being addressed? are the methods appropriate to the research question? And again, I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but it's very important that when doing research, we use the appropriate method for the question that we're trying to ask. And you would be surprised how often the two don't match, actually. And then what are the main findings and the implications? So that's the real, that's what you'll find often in the conclusion, and will really help you to formulate your idea about whether you think this is a useful piece of research. So now moving on to the next slide, and the approach. So I've divided the approach up here into 3 parts. And I think this is sort of a general approach to reading a paper, and it will vary. Different people do tend to take different approaches, but this is modelled on the approach that I would take when I'm reading a paper. So the first step is a high-level scan, and that's where you'll look at the title, the abstract, the authors, the journal, and the publication date. And you'll ask yourself, is this paper relevant to my purpose? So consider who the intended audience is and what unique insights you hope to gain from reading it. Sometimes the abstract can be quite technical, and sometimes it can also be quite vague. It's quite a short summary of the paper. And so sometimes if you're not getting the information that you need from the abstract in the first read, it may be quite important at that point just to jump straight to the discussion. But at the high level approach, I would tend to stick with the title and the abstract to begin with. Next is the skim and search stage. So here you're sort of scanning for key information without getting too bogged down in the detail. So I would recommend reading the first and last paragraph of the introduction and skimming the results section headings, and then looking for things like the study population. So were they looking at young people? Were they looking at older people who are patients within the NHS? And also look at the methods and the key findings. It's good at this point, I think, to highlight any unfamiliar terms or anything directly relevant to the needs that you have in reading the paper. So I think sometimes if there are lots of technical terms or things you're not familiar with, I would make a note of those and then look them up at the next stage. And then finally is the part where we do the kind of what I would call the critical appraisal. So this is where you really take a closer look at whether the study is valid, whether there are any biases or limitations, things like sample size, and whether the methods are appropriate. So most importantly, again, considering how is this relevant to my own context? Do I trust these findings? Are they relevant? Are they applicable to what I'm trying to do? Next slide, please. Okay, so this is step 1 and the high level approach. So I've included here a public health paper that may or may not be relevant to some of the work that you do. And I've included here the title, and then this is the abstract. So when you're reading scientific papers, often the abstract will be divided out into the introduction, the methods, the results, and the conclusions. But I haven't, in this paper, I haven't included those headings. I've just highlighted the different sections. You'll get a couple of sentences probably on the background, and then more detail on the methods, and then the results and the conclusions. So at this stage, you can look at whether you think the paper is useful, look at the core concepts and the kind of direction that the rest of the paper will take. I think sometimes it can be quite useful at this point to actually try and summarise from the abstract what you think the paper is going to tell you, or does tell you, in a couple of sentences. It can help you kind of anchor your understanding at this point before you go on to read a bit more. So in the example here, you can see from the title already it's telling us about what the problem is, so childhood obesity, and something about the methods and approach that they've taken to doing their research. So in this example, they're tackling childhood obesity in one London neighbourhood using a whole community approach. These kinds of local strategies are still fairly new, and this project was testing what they might look like in practice. So I'll just summarise. You may have already scanned the abstract yourself, but essentially over 3 years, they worked with 6 local primary schools and ran events with children and families. Researchers collected height and weight data and used surveys and interviews and focus groups to understand the impact of the programme. The aim was to reach a wide range of people and to try to lead to small changes in schools, homes and the communities. what they did find, you can see from the abstract, is that actually children's weight broadly stayed the same, and there was very limited behaviour change. But again, we'll have a little bit of a discussion about that, why that might be one of the findings as we move through. So let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so when you're reading an article, you don't sort of have to start at the first word and battle all the way through, as I think I've kind of explained. And I think skimming and searching for key terms can be really important. It gives you a quick impression and it saves time and helps you decide if you want to look at the paper further. So if you need something specific, actually using the Control F function can be really useful. So if you have if you're looking in a very specific area and there's key terms, and we often use this when we're doing literature searches, when we're looking through a large volume of papers, if there's specific things that we're looking for, that actually using that Control F function can be really useful. But beyond that, looking at the introduction, the figures, the discussion, the conclusion, and looking for some of those key terms can often tell you most of what you need to know. You can underline words you don't know and look them up. And also, just to say at this point, you shouldn't be afraid to drop papers that are too technical or irrelevant, because it may be that you get that sense very quickly from just reading the abstract. And actually, if you waste time battling the difficult papers, it could be time better spent on other papers. So just to say, even as academics, sometimes papers aren't always well written, and sometimes it's best just to put it to one side and look at something different. Right, so in this slide, I've extracted the first and last paragraph of the introduction, the background section. So you can see the block of text on the right. Background sections can often be quite dense, and they should describe the problem and then the approach that they were taking. But what I found is often you can get that information from the first paragraph and the last. And I've highlighted here some of the key aspects of these two paragraphs. So you can see here that there was an intervention and to tackle childhood obesity, that they've made that connection between deprivation, low socioeconomic status, and often higher rates of obesity, and that's what they're trying to target. They've used the pilot approach because they're not sure whether this intervention works, and they've recruited 6 local schools. The second paragraph is quite interesting because it tells you then the approach that they took to evaluating the intervention. And importantly here, you can see that they worked with researchers at the University of Kent, which already tells you there was some level of independence between the people who were implementing the intervention, and then it was a different group of people that evaluated it. You can see here that they used quantitative data for their analysis, and part of that they did a process evaluation. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the headings that are used in the results section often give you a snapshot of the results. And so if you focus on the results first, I think that's often the best approach. The methods can be important, particularly if you want to replicate the study, but I think they can also be quite complicated sometimes, and the results can tell you a lot of what you need to know. So you can anticipate that from the headings shown, this is the kind of information that you're going to get in the results section. So I've copied and pasted from the paper I've shown you the headings that they've used. So reach is likely to tell you something about how broadly the intervention connected with the target population. So how many schools, what the sample size looked like. Efficacy is likely to be about the outcomes of the intervention, what seemed to change or seemed to work. Adoption will be about how many community members took on the intervention, so how many schools were involved, and within those schools, how many children were involved. Implementation will tell us something about how the programme worked in the real world setting, so how it was implemented and whether that worked, how that worked. And then maintenance is around whether there was any sustainable change, whether things were embedded into long-term practices. So again, you can see from the results section, from the headings, it doesn't tell you an awful lot, but it really signposts you to what you're going to find in each section. And it may be that some sections will be more useful to your reading aims than others. And then here I've just included, so in this paper, there was just one table and it outlined the community activities. So that's quite good because it indicates that you can get a sense of the components of the programme and actually how it worked in practice. So the headings actually spell WE-AIM, which is an established framework for looking at assessing interventions. So it indicates that they're using a framework and they know what they're doing. So that can be quite helpful too. Okay, so it's also at this point just worth mentioning that at the start and end of each section is often where authors will place their key messages. So I think as beginning of the results, end of the results, but actually all of those sections, to start with the first paragraph and the last, can often be really useful in terms of getting a sense of the key messages of the paper. Okay, next slide, please. So step 3 is the critical appraisal. So this is where we sort of closely examine the research method, and they can get quite technical, but it helps to look out for a few sort of key elements. So, for example, sample size is something that we're often very interested in. Largely, broadly speaking, the larger the sample size, the better, but it does depend on the research methods. And actually, if qualitative research methods are used where interviews are done or focus groups, you'll often find the sample size is much smaller. So again, thinking about what was the sample size and is that well suited to the research method that they use? Was it based only on a narrow group of people, or was the sample quite representative of the wider community that the authors are looking at? Were objective measures like weight and height taken, or did the authors rely on self-reported answers that may not be accurate, kind of subject to recall bias, and often people may give responses that they think the researchers want to hear rather than perhaps a more objective position on the answer to the question they're answering. You may also want to ask, did the study design really match the question? And again, you know, now is not the time to go into the different types of study, but randomized controls trials, often seen as kind of the gold standard, often require a bigger sample size, whereas realist evaluation or consensus methods, which are some of the newer methods that are being used now, can often be good for exploring experiences or complex systems and may not need such a big sample size. It also matters in terms of the structure of the paper, what kind of paper you're reading. So a systematic review might take a slightly different format to the paper that I've shown you here. It will pull together lots of studies and it may be set out slightly differently. And qualitative research, again, gives insights into people's experiences. So it will often be more wordy and might include quotes and large chunks of text that you need to work through. So I think finally, 2 questions to ask yourself is whether the group that was studied represented the wider population, and also, is this a study that is what we call cross-sectional, so it will give you a snapshot of what's going on in the here and now, or is it more of a longitudinal study that will give you evidence around correlations of effects or tell you something about long-term impacts? So I think all of these things, when perhaps you're a bit of a beginner at doing research or approaching academic papers, can feel quite big and quite complex, but this is really just to give you a sort of an introduction to the kind of things that it's important to think about when we're reading a paper, especially in terms of whether the authors actually set out, whether they did what they set out to do. So I think key questions like that in terms of whether the research question matches the methodology and whether the conclusions actually follow through from what was shown in the results can be really important. It's also important to point out that aside from the paper, it may be that you can, reading a paper can give you a signposting to other important papers that may also be relevant to the area that you're interested in. So looking at the literature review in more detail might be useful, the reference list, but also if you're finding papers using PubMed or other search engines, you'll get recommendations for similar articles, which can be really useful if you want to look further at subject area. Next slide, please. So not every research paper has a section called limitations, but every study will have challenges or weak areas. Even if they don't label it, you can usually find these mentioned in the discussion. And the limitations are often the kind of more interesting part of the paper because it shows what's still missing and perhaps what future research needs to address. So the paper that I've showed you didn't include a limitations section, but I've just pulled out what I found. So you can see here that they some of the limitations that they found were that the questionnaires that they used were unvalidated, which means they hadn't been tested in other groups or in other situations. So they recognised that there wasn't something already available and they developed their own questionnaires, but those haven't been validated. There was also a relatively low sample size, which I've mentioned before can sometimes be important, and participation was voluntary. So often you'll find that certain types of people may be more likely to step forward and volunteer to be involved in studies. So overall, they didn't find a significant change in behaviour, but they did recognise that they'd only done short-term follow-up. And there was some changes in terms of the community's awareness of healthy behaviours. And I think that the sense I got from reading the paper was that the authors felt that there might be longer term changes just from implementing the programme in the short term. Okay, next slide. So after following the 3 steps, you'll become very familiar with the article without reading all of it. And I think it will give you questions around the why and the how. So think about why they've approached the topic in this particular area and how they've got the conclusions from the results that they've presented. Your knowledge will build as you read more articles, and you can make notes using the headings that I've included here as you read through, which I think can be quite useful. As you read, you can select key points or interesting statements that the authors make, and then really think about the why and the how. And I think just to bear in mind too that not everything in the article will be relevant. So really just critiquing the bits that you're interested in and thinking about perhaps the bits that you don't agree with. Next slide, please. Great. So I've just included some links here to help you to begin to think about how to read academic papers. So the Cochrane Evidence Essentials is a free interactive online learning resource, and that's been developed by Cochrane. And it's to help people understand the basics of evidence-based medicine and health research. So it's aimed at patients and carers and healthcare professionals, but really anybody that's interested in health decisions and reading papers, clinical trials and evidence systematic reviews. That's freely available from the website. And the other tool in there is the Understanding Health Research tool. That's been created by the University of Glasgow. It's also free and it focuses on the study design methods, potential biases and the strength of the evidence. And I've also included there a link to a blog and an academic paper. But just to reiterate again that academic papers aren't always easy to follow. And not all of them are well written. So if you've got one that's difficult to understand, it's often not a reflection on you and your ability to understand. And I think even experienced readers can really struggle with poorly written papers, as with anything in life. It's always hard to read something that is not well written. And then just the summary slide, please. So when we're working on evidence-based approaches or putting together grant applications or thinking about what we know in a topic area, research papers can be a really valuable resource. The key is to not get bogged down in every detail straight away, but start by reading, skimming the sections and getting the main messages as quickly as you can. And often they can be found in the abstract and the conclusions. You get a sense of what the paper's about and what they found, and then it enables you to step back and critically think, is this strong evidence? Is this relevant to what I'm doing? And I think the critical lens helps us decide on, whether we can build on this in some way or whether we can take what someone else has done and implement it in our local area. And just in terms of thinking about you in your teams, it may be useful to create a kind of community of practice with your team to support each other with paper reading. So it may be that a monthly journal club could help build skills and build discussion around topic areas that might be common topics of interest for lots of people in your team. And I think that's the end of my slides. So I think we do just now have 5 minutes for questions. I hope that's been helpful. I can't see the chat, so I'm not sure if there's any in the chat or if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question directly.
There are no questions in the chat at the moment.
Okay.
I don't know if anyone wants to ask a question.
I think there's a question there about using Prism and other kind of frameworks, and I would just say yes. I think, you know, frameworks can be really, really useful for helping you to pick out, you know, outcome measures, population samples, and all that kind of thing. So I think there's lots of frameworks out there, and I would definitely recommend using those. It depends on how much detail and how confident you are in reading papers, but there are lots of frameworks out there. I mean, I touched on this before, but I think sometimes that, you know, your research question should link to your methods, which should pull through to your results and your discussion. So the question that authors set out to answer at the very beginning should be the one that they then address in the conclusions. And it's surprising how often that doesn't always read through. So I think taking a really critical approach to reading a paper, 30 minutes isn't very long in honesty to go through this. And when I've done it in the past, I've circulated a paper to read beforehand, and then we've gone through it and done it as a group activity. And I think if you're interested in doing that within your teams, even if you're relatively inexperienced at doing this, it can be really helpful because you'll find that different people will always pick out different things within the paper. And I think, you know, developing those analytical skills can be really useful and can also decrease the time it takes you to read papers if you're reviewing lots of papers in a short, you know, with a timeline deadline. Yeah.
Sorry, could I ask a question? I've got my hands up.
Oh yes, sorry, Lynn.
Yeah, just a quick one. For people who, because I am about to set up a journal club within the council, and I want to help colleagues who haven't got, you know, experience in terms of reading papers, etc., etc. So, what's the best framework in terms of evaluating a paper? I was told CASP, but is that is it not too complicated, or is there anything like for beginners, if you like?
Yeah, so some of the links that I put on the slides are a good place to start. I would recommend having a look at those. It depends a bit sometimes on the paper that you're reading to, because there's different frameworks for understanding different types of papers. So qualitative papers, clinical trials. But I would say there were some papers published by Trish Greenhalgh back in 1997. I mean, they're pretty old now, but she published, I think it was BMJ, a whole selection of papers, and she reviewed each kind of paper and an approach to take, and actually it's still entirely valid. And I think for beginners, certainly it's a really good place to start. So
excellent, thank you.
We can share that link. Yeah,
yes,
I can look.
Thank you
yeah,
so
we may have to do that after this webinar, but I can make that link available. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you.
I think we've got 1 minute left if there's any more questions. Thank you everyone for joining. I hope that was useful.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.